Today I'm going to be talking about Gatsby and GraphQL schema stitching with Drupal. My name is John Alvin Wilkins. I work at Amazia Labs and I'm a senior front-end developer and breaker of designs that expect short content. If you're a front-end developer, that's like 10% of your job, right? Look at the designs and just shove a whole bunch of text into one spot and see what design breaks, right? Because that's what your content editors are going to do. They're going to put way too much stuff in a title, or they're just going to be like German, right? And they have words that are 37 characters long. So, I've been doing Drupal for a long time, like Drupal 4.5, which I've almost doubled, I guess, in the version numbers. 9.0 comes out. Looking forward to that. Yeah. So, today, the demo code that I am writing for this presentation, it's mostly done, but it's completely done as far as this presentation goes. Drupal has this really cool install profile called Umami. And if you install a new Drupal site and you use the Umami demo profile, it gives you this lovely website with a whole bunch of sample content. And the JSON API people did a great job. They actually created a Gatsby build using the JSON API. So if you actually go to the GitHub repo for Gatsby under examples using Drupal, there's some code there that you can actually run a Gatsby build and it pulls the data out of a live Drupal site using the JSON API and builds this site using the Umami content. Okay? And my goal is to do the same thing, but for the new Drupal GraphQL 3.0 module, which is almost released. We're on the RC3 right now. So my goal is to do the same thing and to eventually get it into the Gatsby repo as well. And I would like it to look a little bit more like how Drupal's Umami site looked like, rather than sort of a simplified design here. That's the goal. Not quite there, but I will give you all access to the GitHub repo for what I have so far, which is going to be some really good stuff, especially for schema stitching. All the stuff that you need for that is already in the repo. The only bits that I haven't finished is just the design, the bits that make it look like Umami. So the styling is not done. That's the only thing that's not done. Everything else is good stuff. Okay, so today I'm going to go over some GraphQL terminology. How many people here still feel like they're really new at GraphQL? Great. When I was submitting this session talk, I was like, Gatsby and GraphQL query stitching, and I wrote up this proposal and I showed off my team to have them look at it. And one of my teammates, Blage, was like, John, it's not called query stitching, it's called schema stitching. So getting the terminology, we're all relatively new to this stuff, and having us all on the same page for solid terms, I think is going to be really useful for the rest of the presentation. So we're going to spend a little bit of time just getting that all nailed down tight. Then we're actually going to get into it. So why GraphQL? And then why schema stitching? Okay. Then talking about how we configure Gatsby and Drupal GraphQL and having it all work together. Then we're going to do some live demoing of the actual GraphQL queries that you might run if you're trying to do a multilingual Gatsby and Drupal build of your site. Right? And then finally, I'm going to give you some multilingual and routing tips of some strategies you might use to build your own Gatsby site. Okay, so terminology, right? So on the left here, we have a GraphQL query, right? It's pretty simple. It looks a lot like JSON a little bit, right? So you have your query, and we're asking for potatoes and radishes and carrots, right? And some nested data there. And you send that query to an endpoint. And there is one URL for all of the data, right? So this little illustration here illustrates how the graph looks, like how the data is related to each other. But it's all, that whole thing is one endpoint, one URL where you're sending these queries to, okay? And then of course we're going to get some data back. Now let's look at what are fields, right? So every single one of those labels inside the query is a field, right? And then all the little circles in the illustration are also fields. And you can see here that like this circle on the illustration, that's our leaves. So obviously the little circle in between the Gatsby logo and the orange circle, that's going to be our potato field, right? And those fields that are at the root of our query are called root fields. And in the illustration, they're the fields that are directly connected to the, the center of our illustration where the Gatsby logo is. Root fields, regular fields. Now let's look at the data that comes back. The data that comes back, it looks like regular JavaScript objects, generic JavaScript objects, but that potato is not a regular JavaScript object. It is a potato, capital P object. It is a strongly typed data. GraphQL returns strongly typed data. So all that means is that it has, you can't just arbitrarily stuff new stuff into our potato object. You have to define how that potato object works. And in this case, we're defining it, our potato is saying it has leaves, and those leaves are emojis with a capital E. Right? So this is a definition of our object, and it always looks this way. We can have, you can like not have certain fields in it in a particular return data. You may not have all the fields, but when those fields exist in the object, they are defined this way. Okay? So those definitions are called types. And then lastly here, a schema. The schema, it is the description of all the fields and their types and like how they're nested together, right? That's what a schema is. Obviously, it's important to understand what schema means since we're talking about schema stitching. So, GraphQL obviously been really, really popular. I've gotten a lot of buzz recently. And in the JavaScript world, there's always a lot of buzz about some new thing. Is GraphQL just like the new shiny? I mean, there's a Star Wars GraphQL service where you can like query using GraphQL queries and get information about all the movies and their characters and the home planets and all that stuff. GitHub has a new service where instead of using their old REST API, you actually use GraphQL and get information about all the repositories, about the users. You can get all that information using a GraphQL service on GitHub now. Gatsby, of course, has GraphQL built into it. So you can query everything about your Gatsby build using GraphQL. And now Drupal core plus the GraphQL contrib module gives you a GraphQL service as well. Now, when we are comparing this to other REST services like JSON API, it can seem like we're just like comparing like different endpoints. But the thing is that GraphQL is more than just an endpoint. And trying to do these sort of apples to apples comparison can be tricky. And it really, it sort of undersells GraphQL when you try to do those kind of comparisons of just like, how does this one endpoint to endpoint compare? So I want to show you how GraphQL is a bit special. It's different than just an endpoint. Right? One thing, it is a single endpoint. And if you look at a JSON API, if you go to like the root JSON API endpoint, it actually gives you a list of all the other endpoints that are available at this server. So if I wanted information about blocks, I would actually have to use this other URL endpoint to get information about blocks. Right? So in JSON API, we have a series of endpoints, all gives you different kinds of data. And since GraphQL only has a single URL that you configure, obviously it still needs to give you the same kind of data. It needs a query language so that you get the data that you actually want. So you send your query, you can get any kind of data out of the single endpoint. And if GraphQL was just these two things, you could do apples to apples comparison. You'd be like, hey, this is kind of nice that it's like this. But JSON API folks will have strong arguments for why this kind of comparison would favor JSON API. And there are definitely use cases for JSON API. I'm not the right person to ask about them because I don't know what they are. But I don't want to say that GraphQL is better here. The last thing that makes GraphQL way different than an endpoint is this very wonky thing, which is data storage agnostic and per field storage. This is super technical, and it's not obvious at all why this makes GraphQL so different. So I want to go through a couple more slides to actually give you examples so you understand what makes this a game changer. Let's jump right into it. And we're going to use one that hopefully, an example that hopefully many of you have seen before. How many people have actually played with Gatsby before? About half of you. Okay. So Gatsby has this plugin system where you install different plugins and you can get different kinds of data, right? So there's a plugin for Markdown files. So when you configure your Gatsby build to use the Markdown plugin, it'll read .md files from your directory and actually grab HTML out of there, titles and like metadata. That's all sort of defined inside your Markdown files. And all you have to do is add this plugin, and you get all this data, and you can query for it inside GraphQL. You can also query for image data, right? And just JSON data. So this is going to be JSON data that you've fetched from some service, or just JSON files sitting in a directory. And all of these things are different kinds of data. These are different sources, okay? And so GraphQL allows you to define per field where the source of this information is coming from. Gatsby plugins use that GraphQL ability to say, hey, I'm going to grab for this field, I'm going to grab that data from Markdown files. And for this other field, I'm going to grab the information from images on a directory. And in this other field, I'm going to grab all the source of that from JSON data. This is really powerful, and that means when we go and look at what that means for GraphQL in general, each field can have its own source of information, which means that we might have a spot in our graph that grabs data from a SQL database. And we're going to have another spot in the same graph that grabs stuff from a JSON API service. And another spot in our GraphQL that actually grabs data from a completely separate GraphQL service. And it all becomes a unified graph that we're using for our application. This is the thing that makes GraphQL so much different from a regular endpoint. And typical apps, well, not typical apps, in many apps, you actually have to pull data from lots of different places. GraphQL allows you to configure those lots of different places into one graph. So your developers have this experience of, I don't have to know how to fetch data from a JSON. I've had, somebody's already set up my GraphQL graph so that I just do a regular GraphQL query to get data out of JSON API. I don't have to know this other third-party GraphQL service. I've got my local graph set up. I can just query that to get it. It becomes much simpler for developers to get all these disparate pieces of information through one unified interface. This is really what makes GraphQL special, and much more than an endpoint. Okay, so let's look at schema stitching. Schema stitching is literally taking two separate GraphQL services and merging them, stitching them together, right? So let's do a simple case. We're going to take the Star Wars graph and the GitHub graph and merge it together. Right, so that was super easy. This kind of merge, all we've done, actually, go back here. All we've done here is we've taken all of the root fields from the Star Wars API and all of the root fields from the GitHub graph and put them into a new graph, right? Obviously, I can't tell GitHub, hey, can you add the Star Wars API to your endpoint? And I can't ask Star Wars to add the graph. Right, so I'm going to have to create my own endpoint. Right? But I've created a new endpoint, and I've stitched in the Star Wars root fields into my graph, and all of the GitHub root fields into the same graph. So one new endpoint getting all the data from the two different sources. And this has very specific requirements. You can't do this every single time. And one is that all the root fields have to have unique names. Right? This makes sense, right? We can't have a Star Wars all files root field and a GitHub all files root field, because then when I ask for the all files, which service am I getting it from, right? They have to have unique names. And then the other thing is that they have to have unique types. Right? So we can imagine that there's a person object that is in the Star Wars API, right? And there's a person object in the GitHub GraphQL. These types look similar, they all have names, but you know, in the Star Wars API, you've got a list of weapons, and I don't know how you use GitHub, but I don't use weapons a whole lot. Conversely, Luke Skywalker probably doesn't have a Git repo, right? R2D2 may. Right, so these have the same name. These types have the same name, but they're different definitions. So you cannot merge, you can't stitch using this simple method if you have these kind of conflicts, right? But you can still stitch, you just can't do the simple case. So let's look at an advanced case. We're going to take Gatsby's graph and Drupal's graph and stitch them together. How would this look? So here you can see I'm actually still accessing the GraphQL endpoint, but I've stitched Drupal's graph into Gatsby's graph. And the way that I ensured that all the root queries have unique names is by adding a new root field. And I just sort of arbitrarily gave it a name of Drupal, right? So now, if Drupal had an all files and Gatsby had an all files, there's no longer any conflicts here because Drupal's all files is nested under the Drupal root field. So there's no more conflicts, right? This is a great way to ensure that all your root fields have unique names. And the second thing that we do is we need to ensure that all the types have unique names. And so we're going to take all the types from the Drupal graph and prefix those names with Drupal underscore. And that just ensures that there are no conflicting type names. And I called this the advanced case, but this is actually the way that the Gatsby-Source GraphQL plugin works in Gatsby. It does this by default. This is the way it does a merge of Gatsby's graph with a third-party GraphQL graph. You configure what the root field name should be, and you configure what the type prefix should be for the extra graph that you're merging in. It's super easy. This is the configuration. Going to gatsbyconfig.js, you've got your plugins array, and you just add a new plugin to that list, which is an object there with a resolve that gives you the name of the plugin you want to use. In this case, we're going to use GraphQL plugin. And you configure it so that if you tell it what the type prefix is by saying what the type name is, so it's going to take all the Drupal types and prefix them with Drupal underscore. So it like adds an underscore and then adds that to all the type names. And then the root field that is going to nest all of Drupal underneath, in this case is going to be called umami, because I've got the umami demo site that I've merging into my Gatsby GraphQL. So I'm going to use umami as the name for my root query. And then of course I have to point at my Drupal's GraphQL endpoint, so it knows where to get all this data from. This is it. This is everything you need to do in order to do schema stitching inside Gatsby. It's super easy to configure. And of course, you can add multiple graphs to Gatsby. So if I wanted to add the Star Wars API in addition to Drupal, I just add another plugin using the exact same plugin, but with different data. So I'm going to add the Star Wars API as an additional graph stitched into Gatsby's graph. Super, super easy. Now, one thing that isn't on here is how to secure your Drupal installation. The Star Wars API is completely public. You can query it like go get out, but you don't want that to be how your Drupal site works, right? So we want to secure that. So I'm going to show you how to do it, and it is also fairly easy. If you go to the Drupal modules site, after you installed GraphQL 3.0 RC3, which is the latest release, trying to get them to have a 3.0 official release, but apparently one of the bugs that I submitted hasn't been fixed yet, so we're waiting on that, and then it'll have a 3.0 release very, very soon. But once you've added that to your site, you're going to see a GraphQL section on your modules page. You just need to install the GraphQL module, which gives Drupal an endpoint, but no content, and then the GraphQL core module, which gives you all the data from Drupal core's modules, right? Not from contrib modules, but it handles the content from core modules. And then lastly, to secure it, you're going to want to add the HTTP basic authentication. Install that module. This comes with Drupal core. So you install those 3 modules, and then you have to go to the permissions page and add one checkbox here, right? Which is that we want to allow authenticated users to execute arbitrary GraphQL queries, right? Because since we're building a Gatsby site, we have development users who are running GraphQL queries that they're writing, on their laptops, and we want to have them use a authenticated Drupal user to have their laptop connect to the Drupal server, and you do that by checking that box. You don't have to use all authenticated users. You can do different roles, or specific users that you want to use, but that's the checkbox you're going to need to add for whatever role that you want to use for doing Gatsby builds. Okay. This is all you need to do on the Drupal site. On the Gatsby site, this is the last thing you need to do to secure Drupal, which is, of course, you need to tell Gatsby how to authenticate against Drupal now. So we'll go back into our Gatsby config.js file. We're going to have to import one NPM module called B2A, and all it does is it base64 encodes strings. So we're going to have to take our username and password and put a colon in between the two and put it in a string, and then base64 encode that whole thing and send it as a header. So down here in our configuration for GATSBY-SOURCE-GRAPHQL, we add a header section underneath the URL here. We need to send a authorization header, and the content of the authorization header is basic space and then this base64 encoded string, right? So we're encoding our endpoint username, a colon, and our password. This little bit of JavaScript here is using environment variables. So we've configured, this stuff. We don't want it in our GitHub repo necessarily. So we've configured it so that it's available in environment variables, but not in this file in our GitHub repo. So this is one way to make sure you're not posting stuff to a GitHub repo that you don't want posted. Right. So alternatively, you could just, admin, right? But this is not very secure. I don't recommend it. And you definitely don't want to commit this to your public GitHub repo and then screenshot it and put it in a presentation and then videotape it and post it on YouTube. That would be very bad. So instead, do something like this, okay? Or at least make sure that your GitHub repo is, a private one instead of a public one. And that's it. Now you've only allowing authenticated users to access your GraphQL endpoint. Live demo time. Woo! And let's see, how are we doing on time? Okay, cool. So that means I need to turn on my Drupal site and start up my Gatsby develop. So Gatsby has a really nice develop script that you can add to your package.json. I've got this running here. And going through a bunch of stuff here, waiting for the development server that will do hot module reloading in a second. And also, this Gatsby develop will also provide a graphical interface that you can use. We're going to use this right here to do some queries. So let's go over here. And of course, that is way too small to actually see. So I'm going to use my senior front-end developer skills to break designs. That looks pretty good. About 200. Okay, I'm going to close the documentation because I know I don't need that. That should make this readable. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to query for some Gatsby data just to prove that this really is the Gatsby GraphQL endpoint. I'm going to go into the all markdown. Oops. Sorry, just a second. I'm going to go into the all markdown remark root fields and grab, no, not from edges, from nodes. I want to grab the title and the date and the HTML out of some markdown files. So prove that this is actually Gatsby running here. You can see here, this is straight from some of the tutorials on Gatsby's site. Sweet Pandas Eating Sweets, this is pulled information from a markdown file that's in one of their tutorials. There's the HTML, there's the date, all of this stuff comes from a markdown file. So we're really querying a markdown file with this little query here. Okay? Now, in the same query, I've also got the Star Wars API. So I'm going to jump down into my swappy root field, and I'm going to query for General Organa here, and get her name, her homeworld, birth year, and let's see what vehicles that she prefers. And I'm going to rerun this query. And again, this is one query with Gatsby data and Star Wars API all in one thing. I'm going to run that now, and it's going to get the results. Here's the markdown stuff again. Oops, not that one. Markdown here. Oh, I can look at my own screen because I'm mirroring. Okay, there we go. And you can see here we now also have Star Wars API stuff. So we can see we have Princess Leia, General Leia, Organa, and okay, cool vehicles. She's Imperial speeder bike. Nice. That is the data coming out of Star Wars API, all with one query. And now I'm going to go and also query Drupal in the same query. So I'm going to look at the Omami root field. That's how I have Gatsby configured. And I'm going to grab some data from menus, I guess, here. Yep. So this is going to query some menus. Yeah, this should work. I don't know why it's showing a big old. No, it didn't work. Okay, let me try this. I did something off here. But this should be right. Live demos. Okay.
Is it defined in the query at the very top?
Language, English. Wait. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yep, there.
Up here, it is not. Wait, is that how you did? Oops. Yeah.
I think you need to define the type.
Yeah, I do. Which is Drupal language ID. There we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we're running one query, which is getting Gatsby Markdown files, Star Wars API, and Drupal stuff all together. Here's the Markdown files, that's the Star Wars API, and this is straight out of Drupal. Got a home link, link to articles, link to recipes. This is querying Drupal's menu system. Super easy. I'm gonna drink some water. Excellent. Now back to a couple slides, and then some more. Gatsby actually has a whole bunch of underlying GraphQL APIs. I listed them all here. I can't really say anything about them because I haven't played with them yet. But actually, this URL is going to be more helpful. They've been blogging about these stuff. In particular, Mikhail Novikov has been writing a lot about these APIs, and you can see all those blog posts about the underlying APIs at this URL. My dream is actually to do some really advanced thing, and I haven't yet done it yet, but I want to show you my idea, which is basically to sort of invert the default GATSBY-SOURCE-GRAPHQL plugin, and instead of nesting all of Drupal's roots are in Gatsby's endpoint root, and Gatsby stuff is nested under GraphQL root. I don't know if this is possible, but this is like what I would like to do. And the reason for that is that meant that at build time I would have this graph, and then when my application is in the browser, I don't have access to Gatsby's GraphQL endpoint anymore because it's in the browser and it was only run during build time. But Drupal site is still live. I could still do extra queries against Drupal's endpoint, and I can do that now just with the way that this plugin works right now. But it would be really nice if I could use the exact same queries during build time and at runtime, and without having this sort of nested thing and all my types being different, because that means I would have to, if the types and the nesting was different, it would have different queries and different endpoints. So I would love it if I could do this. I don't know if it's possible. This is the thing we're going to be playing with their endpoint APIs and seeing if it's possible. Let's see. When does this session end? In 10 minutes?
12:05.
12:05. Okay, so 15 minutes left. I think I'm gonna skip to the routing, and then come back to multilingual. All of the multilingual GraphQL queries are inside the demo code that I've already posted on GitHub, and I'll give you that URL in a second. So you can see those queries and use them in your own applications. They're super useful if you need to use a multilingual site. But let's go to routing and probably more questions then afterwards and do the multilingual way. That's like afterwards, just talking. So routing, let's look at how Drupal does routing, because we need to think about how we want to do routing inside when we do Gatsby builds, right? So when you have a browser request, it asks for this particular URL, and then Drupal has to look up and see what the internal URL is, so it'll convert it into like node 42, and then it knows that, oh, well, this is a node entity type, and then it has a bundle called blog, right? And then it has like PHP function that actually uses to resolve that and return some HTML to you. This is a simplified version, obviously. For views, it's similar. You're still requesting like a URL, but the internal URL is the same as the external URL. They're not separate with views. So Drupal just looks up, it knows the machine name of that view, and then it like does the PHP resolver and sends back things. That means when we are trying to figure out how to build a list of things in Gatsby, the only thing that we can get out of, that we can query for in Drupal when we're looking at a view is the URL, right? There's no internal path, there's no like node 42 or whatever, and the only thing that we know about a particular page that we queried is that it's, /English/block. So that means that our best approach to doing routing in Gatsby is actually to look at the URLs that we query for and then try to find patterns in those URLs in order to decide which React templates we want to use to build those pages, right? So with Gatsby, we're trying to get a list of all of our URLs, and then we take those lists and build individual pages for every single thing. And rather than querying to get like node/42, there's no reason. We just want to configure Drupal to use like path auto so that we have recognizable patterns that we can use in Gatsby. So if we have /language/ some sort of pattern and then the editor choice for the ending of the URL, if we can configure path auto to do that, then we're golden in Gatsby because we can just do a regex mapping straight to a particular JavaScript file in React to build our Gatsby pages. I'm going to show you what this looks like. So I've just created an array of these mappings, and each entry in the mapping is a regex expression which is trying to match against our URLs, and then like the path to the component I want to use to build that page. Right? So I've listed the articles and recipes for my nodes first because those are really easy to match against. Boom, if the URL matches article/whatever, I'm going to use that, node-article.js. If it matches recipes/whatever, I'm going to use the node recipes.js. Same thing with taxonomy terms. We're going to have a similar configuration. So recipes-category/whatever, that's a taxonomy term. Same thing for tags. And then for our views, we're just going to sort of have to hard code what those URLs are. We're going to have to remember what those URLs are from our Drupal configuration. So we know that /articles, just that URL, means we need to use an index-articles.js. So this is going to be our Gatsby page that builds a list of articles. And /recipes, and just that's it, that URL, we're going to do index-recipes. And then lastly, we've got to look for the homepage, of course, so just like /, right? And that's going to be index.js. And then, actually not lastly, second to lastly, if we have a URL that doesn't match any of those other patterns, this is probably a node page because those have whatever URLs the content editor decided to put, right? There's probably not going to be a pattern. So we have that as a catch-all. So anything that doesn't match any of the previous ones we're going to assume it's going to be a node page. So now we have this array of regex expressions mapped to specific JavaScript files. And then we just use this little JavaScript function to check all that stuff. So if we, inside our gatsby-node.js file, if we've got a list of URLs and we know which language those URLs go with, we tell it which language it's using and what the URL is, the slug. Gatsby calls these slugs. And all that first line where it sets the URL constant, it strips out the language part of the URL and just uses the rest of that URL to check against our path mapping. So then down here, we're going to loop through the path mapping array and just run our regex. And when one of these returns true, we know we've found the first match, right? And we're going to say, hey, it's this component. So based on the URL that we gave and the language that we specified, it's going to return the specific JavaScript file we need to use. So this is how I recommend doing Gatsby routing to figure out how you can map your Drupal URLs to actual JavaScript files. All of this code is in the GitHub repo. Yeah, go ahead.
But this means that like if the editor goes in and creates a custom path auto, the whole thing will...
Right. I mean, if the content editor adds a new path auto thing, you're going to have to update your mapping, right? But there's no way to like query Drupal for path auto paths, not easily. That would be really hard. It's just way easier to like talk to each other. You know? So that's it. So I just finished the slides this morning, so I will post them onto Twitter so you can find them. So you're going to have to follow me on Twitter in order to get the slides. But the demo code is at this URL. So all of that code stuff, you can find it on this repository. So questions? Yeah, go ahead.
What does GraphQL think about not read queries other than read queries?
Right. So the question was about not reading queries. So I mean like posting. Like,
yeah. Does it have an opinion about that?
GraphQL does have a thing called mutations. With Gatsby, Gatsby wouldn't care at all about mutations, right? Because you can't run a mutation through Gatsby's endpoint because Gatsby's endpoint is no longer running once you have static HTML files. That can still be done on the client side. So you run Gatsby, you build static HTML files, but those static HTML files can still like do a React rehydration and have like a real React app loading in your browser. And then that code can then query Drupal to do mutations. That would be how you would have to handle it. So that would be like doing form submissions, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you treat them as two? So would you? I'm just thinking about the integration. Would you treat them as two separate things, whereas Gatsby's on one side and it's maybe just to display content, client facing, and Drupal is just administration side? Just wondering if you talk a little more about that. Make sense?
Yeah. So at Amazing Labs, we've actually been trying out a lot of different things. This particular scenario, it would be, we're talking about having Gatsby build a whole bunch of static HTML files from your Drupal site. That's going to be the client, the end user facing stuff, right? They're going to come to like Netify or Mazy.io or wherever it is that the HTML files are hosted, and they're going to read those Gatsby generated files. And the content editors will be using Drupal, just going to that as a like back-end content editor experience, and none of the end users would be going to the Drupal then for this, right? And unless, of course, like maybe secretly in the background you have some mutations or some extra data that you're grabbing from Drupal. But again, they're not going to be seeing Drupal rendered HTML. They're going to be seeing Gatsby and React rendered HTML. I think there was some hands over here, but I've lost. Other questions?
In the beginning, you mentioned JSON API has the discovery service kind of built in to tell you about what you can go get. Is there anything even remotely like that for GraphQL by default? I did see in that interface that you had, you could, like plot
right.
through and see the different.
Right. So I mean, the question was that JSON API, you go to the root endpoint, and it gives you a list of all the other endpoints, which was a discovery service you can use to figure out what's actually available. GraphQL has something similar. If you like this graphical interface, all you have to do is give it an endpoint. You don't have to configure the schema at all. You just give it the endpoint, and it knows, hey, I need to go grab the schema first. So it's going to grab the entire schema, which is the entire graph. And then this docs that I closed over here on the right-hand side is actually a list of documentation. So you can see what that query object is. So it has the list of all the root fields, and you can dive down into those to find nested roots. All of that is available for you. Graphical, this tool is like, it comes with Gatsby, it comes with Drupal, it also has this with the Drupal module. So you can either read the documentation or do this real cool expandy thing, which they just added to the new Gatsby 2.5, which is pretty sweet. I really like it because you just have to like click on the little, the triangles have fallen off the side of the screen here. There's little triangles next to these words, so when I click on it, it expands out and shows you the children of those root fields. So yeah, that's the discovery service. Honestly, I like this better than the JSON API discovery service. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I missed, sorry for that actually. The final result of this presentation might be a GATSB front-end that grabs data from Drupal side and matches mapping, route mapping, right?
Yeah. So there's nothing that says you have to even look at Drupal URLs per se. You could just like query all the nodes and just like ignore the Drupal configured URLs. You can just do all of the routing and all of your URL generation inside Gatsby. That's totally fine. Drupal content editors have gotten used to being able to write their own URLs. And I was just wanting to show how you can still allow that behavior, because it's quite nice when you're editing content to specify what the URL is. So this is how you could do it. But you don't have to do it this way. You can just do all of the URL generation inside Gatsby.
Is there a cost that comes with stitching all these schemas together from these different sources?
The question was, is there a cost to stitching all this schemas together? So the way that these queries get resolved is with promises, right? So when you request some data inside your client, whether that's in the browser or just like when you're running Gatsby develop, it has to wait for each field to return that data, right? So again, I think those nested bits are also then promises. So it's just waiting for the external service to return, and then it gives you the full return data, right? So the cost is network latency, right? That's it. I think I saw some more hands. Here, go ahead.
Yeah, so could is the schema from one schema made aware of the types from another schema?
Is the schema from one graph aware of the types from another? If you the code that runs GraphQL and stitches all this stuff together, if you're like using Apollo, I think Gatsby uses Apollo under the hood as well. If you try to stitch two graphs together and they have conflicting types and you didn't realize it, that software is going to throw a fit. It's going to like error out and say, no, you can't stitch these together because you've got two types that are conflicting with each other. Right? So individually, these endpoints aren't aware of each other's schemas, but when you do the integration, it knows about conflicts. Okay? I think I saw some hands in the back, maybe? Any other questions? Okay. Oh wait, one more. Okay.
With the advanced stitching and the definition of root fields, I'm curious why you still need the prefixing on the types, since you'll probably, I would assume that it would chain the field requesting with the root field.
That's because of the strong typing. So even though that whole second graph is nested under the new root fields, the definition of the data that comes back is still strongly typed. So when you get back a person, it's not going to tell you, oh, this is a Star Wars person, or this is a GitHub person. It's going to say, this is a person. It is the one definition that we divided for this entire graph. And therefore, just nesting stuff underneath a root field isn't going to fix that problem. So you have to prefix it's like, there's nothing that says you have to prefix all of the types with Drupal. It's just that's the easiest way to ensure there's no conflicts. All you really need to do is, when there's conflicts, rename one of those types.
Gotcha.
But like that's not easy to configure for a plugin, so they just did it this way. It's like prefix all the types, and then no conflicts. Okay.
For a case of the Drupal, like the direct Drupal access and then a Drupal graph looks different, couldn't we just build some functionality into the GraphQL Drupal module that it prefixes itself in some cases that you maybe have two endpoints and one of them always prefixes in one node?
Oh, that's an interesting proposition. So my wish list slide where I was like, I want my graph to look like this. Michael just suggested, what if the GraphQL module did the prefixing for me? And that way the Drupal graph has those field names that are unique already because they've already prefixed them before I even stitched them into Drupal. I would still need to like figure out how to get the Gatsby plugin to not prefix stuff,
Yeah,
but that would be simpler maybe.
You maybe have like a /GraphQL and a /GraphQL with prefix endpoint.
Yeah,
Depending on a Drupal doc.
definitely you could attack this problem from both sides. So yeah. Go ahead.
I'm just curious if you all have run into any issues with enterprising or scaling, I guess, like going from a few pages to hundreds and then having multiple editors. Has that came up yet? Or?
Right, so I know that the JSON API people have totally run into that, and the only reason why I haven't is because I haven't built any big sites like they have. Right, I'm sure that I'm going to run into the same issues. The thing that I think we're both going to be looking at is incremental builds, and I know that the Gatsby team is actually already looking at incremental builds built into Gatsby. So my goal, while I'm still new at Gatsby, is to try to build in a way that's going to be compatible with their plans. Gatsby hasn't yet released this incremental build stuff, but I want to follow the sort of best practices for doing Gatsby builds now, so that I don't like shoot myself in the foot for later on. Because yes, absolutely, there will be pain points when you get to large builds, because currently it rebuilds the whole site every time you do a build. There's some hacky JavaScript that I could write, because of course when I query Drupal, I can see like the change timestamp. So I could like query all the nodes and give me all the change timestamps and just like find the last timestamp and just remember that. And then the next time I query, just give me all the content that's changed since then. And then I would, using some separate cache, I could have like a JSON cache in my previous build and then figure out which bits have expired. Right? You could do that now if you really wanted to. So. Okay, last time. Any questions? No? Okay, lunchtime. Thank you, everyone.